Todd Dunn here. Welcome to the fourth video in my series on building a radio-controlled sailing model of a Morris M36 Day Sailor. This video is part 4, and it's going to cover the installation of the deck and painting and detailing the model. Let's get going. You've seen this picture before. This is the deck sitting next to the hull, but I wanted to show it to you again to talk about a few of the details of installing the deck. The way I decided to install the deck is to make it so that it sits down inside the hull and the top of the deck will be flush with the shear of the hull around the outside. In order to do that, I needed to install a shear clamp, which is basically a little shelf that the deck can sit on and have it at the right level. And because I'm going to have a deck step mast, I wanted to strengthen the deck a little bit where the mast would be. So I installed a deck beam, a single deck beam, right under where the mast will sit. And if you look in the hull, you can see the radio control hardware, which I'll be talking about in the next video. And just ahead of the main sail control arm, which is the long black bit of material that goes athwart ships, is the deck beam that goes across the boat. That deck beam is a 1/4 inch of balsa with multiple layers of fiberglass laminated into it. And that is epoxied into the hull, and the shear clamp is also glued into and fiberglassed into the hull all the way around the top of the hull. And after I finished that, I spent a good deal of time very tediously fitting the deck into the hull so that it was a nice clean fit all the way around. For the actual installation, I did two things. I'll tell you about the first one here. I went all the way around and coated the shear clamp with thickened epoxy, and I wetted out the bottom edge of the deck all the way around with epoxy. And then I set the deck into the hull and pressed it down evenly. Now let's move on to the next picture so I can tell you the second stage of the installation. This picture shows the deck after it's been put down into the epoxy, and if you look closely all the way around the edge of the deck, about every 6 inches, there's a stainless steel screw that I put through the deck into the shear clamp, so the deck is screwed down about every 6 inches. That's to hold the deck down firmly. The next thing I did after I put those screws in is I filled up Ziploc bags with sand, and I put about 30 pounds of sand in large Ziploc bags all over the deck and left it overnight for the epoxy to cure. The next day I took the bags of sand off. The deck was well adhered. I then backed all the screws out because although it's traditional on a real sailboat to glue and screw the deck on, this boat's only going to weigh about 10 pounds and doesn't really need the extra strength. Epoxy is more than enough to hold the deck on. So once I took the screws out, I filled all the screw holes with epoxy, and then I went around the outside edge of the deck and filled the small gap between the hull and the deck with thickened epoxy. I let the epoxy set, sanded it flush, and the deck was installed. The next step was to start painting the deck. So once I had the deck installed, I put everything together and sprayed the deck with the first layer of primer. This first layer of primer serves two purposes. One, it's primer, which gives a better bond for the paint, and two, it shows up any imperfections in the finish. So once I had the first layer of primer on, I went over the entire deck, touched up any imperfections, sanded it fair again, and then primed it a second time. Once that was done, I was ready to move on to top coats. Here is the boat with the first coats of paint on it. I have put a coat of Easy Epoxy Flag Blue on the hull. This is the first of many coats for the hull. And on the deck, I've also put down a coat of Easy Epoxy Gloss White. The deck is going to be painted with 3 different paints. This is the base color, which covers the entire deck. Once the first coat of gloss white is cured out on the deck, the next step is to mask off all the areas that I wanted to stay white. So I very tediously put little strips of masking tape wherever you see white paint here on the deck. And once that was done, I painted the second color on the deck. This color is a contrast color where the non-skid would normally be on the boat. Because this boat's only 36 inches long, I didn't actually put any non-skid texture in, but I did put in a contrast color. The final step, which I haven't gotten to in this picture, was to put all the masking back on where the white was, and then spray the entire deck with flat clear so that the non-skid would not be glossy. This picture also shows the beginning of the detailing of the boat. In particular, I've installed all the on-deck teak. That includes an eyebrow around the top of the cabin house, a teak tow rail, and teak cockpit combing, and teak decking in the cockpit. The teak decking in the cockpit is made out of individual strips of teak cut to a scale width of 2 1/4 inches. On each strip of teak, I glue a piece of black styrene to the edges, and then glue the next strip of teak to that. And that builds me up a layer of teak decking, which is alternating teak and strips of black. And I sand it all smooth and glue it down. So here we are, ready to start varnishing. I should point out one other thing. Right at the bow, you can see a round hole in the deck. That hole is there because on the actual Morris M36, the roller furler drum is recessed below deck level. So I cut that hole in there so that I could put a recessed roller furling drum in. If you look closely at the cockpit, you can also see a couple of other details. Near the aft end of the cockpit, you can see the steering pedestal, which I've installed. And just forward of that, about 1/3 of the way between the aft end of the cockpit seats and the cabin house, there's a white styrene tube sticking up through the middle of the decking. And this is the tube that the main sheet comes up through from the sail control servo. The next step, after I finished all the painting, was to start building detail components. Now we're just going to concentrate on the cockpit for this picture. At this stage, I've pretty much finished varnishing. All of the teak on board the boat, and it is real teak, has 8 coats of Epiphane's gloss varnish. If you look in the cockpit on either side of the steering pedestal, you can see the control winches. These Morris M36s have all the lines led aft below deck, and they pop up in the front of the steering pedestal and also in front of those winches. So those 2 winches are there for line control. And what I do to make winches is I have made patterns for all of the different winch brands, and then I took pieces of 3/16 stainless steel, put them in my lathe, and machined these little self-tailing winches. And if you look closely at these, you can see that the winch is there, and there's a self-tailing jaw at the top, and I'm not sure if you can see the self-tailing arm that's also on each of the winches. I've also built the companionway doors and put in the companionway slide. The companionway slide in this case is a piece of clear styrene that I back paint with flat black paint. Once the paint cures, I glue the slide in, and there's also a teak handle on top of the slide. But this picture shows you all the on-deck teak quite well. You can see the teak tow rail, which is contoured. Took a lot of sanding to get it that way. The teak cockpit combing top, the teak cockpit sole, and the teak companionway doors, as well as the 2 stainless steel self-tailing winches. This picture shows the last couple of cockpit details in place. If you look at the top of the steering pedestal, you can see the compass. This compass is a stainless steel base, and the top of the compass is a clear styrene ball that I cut in half and then polish on the bottom. And underneath the styrene ball, I printed out a compass rose and then glued it to the bottom of the styrene ball and glued the whole thing down. If you look carefully at the compass, I think you can see the compass rose. The other significant detail here is the wheel. The rim on the wheel in this case is mahogany, because I couldn't get the teak to bend the way I wanted it to, but this is a laminated wheel made out of very thin strips of mahogany. They're about a 64th inch thick, and what I did was I made a circle of balsa wood, and then I glued individual strips of mahogany onto the outside edge of the balsa wood circle until I got to the thickness I wanted, and then I sanded it to a round profile on the outside, knocked the balsa wood out, sanded out the inside until all the balsa wood was gone, and then very carefully sanded the entire wheel until it has a round cross section. Then I built the spider that the wheel sits on by machining the center of it and then taking a 1/32 inch diameter stainless steel rod and silver soldering the spokes of the wheel into place on the center core of the wheel. And to attach them to the rim of the wheel, I drilled holes in the rim of the wheel and glued each of the spokes into a hole, and then put the entire wheel onto the steering pedestal. So that actually is very time consuming, and it's quite tricky to silver solder the spokes onto the body of the wheel. So here we are with almost all the detailing in place. There are a couple of things left. I have to install all the deck cleats, which are going to be stainless steel cleats, and I'm going to have to put in the in-tow rail stainless steel chocks, and also you'll see in a little bit the teak handrails on the cabin top. Okay, this picture shows the entire boat when it's finished. We're going to come back and talk about the rig and sails in a later video. But if you look closely, you can see the 3-loop teak handrails on the cabin top. And if you look at the tow rail, you can see midships at least where there's a stainless steel chock. There are bow chocks, midship chocks, and aft chocks. And right next to each chock, inboard of the chock, is a stainless steel flat top cleat. The cleats and the chocks are made from pieces of stainless steel rod that I put up in my milling machine and mill to shape. It's quite time consuming to do, but it works out nicely. Once they've been milled, I sand them down and polish them to a nice high gloss. The teak handrail on top of the cabin is cut from a single strip of teak that I cut the loops in with a Dremel tool, sand the whole thing out, varnish it, and once it's fully varnished, because it's really tough to varnish these things after they're on the boat, I glue the finished handrail down. Okay, if we look closely at the picture, we can see a couple more details. I've painted the bottom of the boat with red bottom paint. I've also painted the white boot stripe, And just below the tow rail, if you look closely, you can see a gold cove stripe, which is made from 24 karat gold vinyl, which I cut on my vinyl cutter and then apply. And at the center of the hull in the cove stripe is the MY for Morris Yachts. On deck, you can just forward to the mast, you can see the deck hatch. The deck hatch is made from balsa wood, and then the outside of the hatch is tapered to the appropriate angle, and then I put on a strip of gloss silver vinyl. The glass in the hatch is another piece of clear styrene that's been back painted with flat back and then glued down with the paint on the bottom to give a nice glossy black finish. So here we are with the fully detailed model. And we're going to come back and talk about some of the other details in the next 2 videos. The next video is going to look at the radio control hardware that's inside the boat, and the final video is going to be about how I built the rig and sails. I hope you enjoyed seeing how I installed the deck, painted the boat, and then detailed the deck. Thanks for watching. If you haven't, please subscribe and don't forget to click the notification bell. And the next video about the radio control hardware should be up in a couple of days.